Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a Podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev but never dared to ask. Today, Laura is joining me, my fellow host on the podcast, and we thought we'd have a chat about the principle of mentoring and learning in principle. So how we actually engage and understand how we develop our skills, how we continuously explore the possibilities of our craft and perfect it. So without further ado, I've introduced myself. Laura, do you want to tell everybody who, assuming that they don't already know, which I think most of them will, Laura, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Laura Donahue. I'm a senior UX researcher at Sutherland Labs. We are a design research consultancy, and I do all sorts of different user experience research, as well as games research, play testing, and just,
all the fun
websites,
stuff.
apps, retail, restaurants, trains, if the people that use it, I visited a train depot once, and we observed engineers use this headset that kind of like read directions for them on how to repair different trains. And that's like a whole separate. It was like one of the coolest days of my career.
Honestly,
but yeah,
that sounds
literally,
amazing.
if people use it, we measure it and observe it, and talk about how to make products better.
One of my favorite things in life, he says, pouring himself a quick drink. Right, so we talked about learning. So I mean, obviously, I think you and I share this view, which is there's no point if we're not learning. The assumption that you know everything is obviously wrong, and obviously I do, but But no, sorry. The point is that I think even the reason why I do podcasts, and like I say, I'm not joking when I call this a Podquest. For me, I genuinely want to learn everything there is to know, and I but don't believe there'll ever be a point where I don't. Now, let's put some structure behind this. Let's have a think about what we're trying to say. So I think there's like a number of different stages we can talk about. We can talk about the kind of the learning process to get into games. I think we've done a few conversations in the past around that area. We can talk about the continuous professionalization of your career, but also kind of stuff that you can do more widely, more generally. And I think there are some structures that we can talk about. So when you're thinking about learning, bearing in mind those kind of like categories that I've kind of tried to lay out, how would you kind of paint the picture of what you think are the kind of key elements of that learning process, that learning journey?
I think there are a couple of things, especially since nowadays, and depending on kind of where you are in your career, there is just so much out there. And at least, just immediately thinking about when I was first getting into UX research about 5 years ago, it was really difficult for me to sift through all of the different boot camps and blogs and books and self-study and all of that, and trying to figure out, what's quality, where is my time and money best going to be spent learning. And so, that becomes particularly, challenging, both, from a time and monetary point of view. And, you're might be switching between careers. So that just brings like a different level of stress that I kind of feel now as someone who, is kind of like mid-senior tier researcher where, got, fundamentals all down, just trying to find new ways to moderate, measure, etc., see what's new and out there. And so I can kind of take, a little more time, have people in my network that are sharing things. So that's a shortcut into, what's going to be quality and interesting. So, there are all sorts of different kind of hurdles and boundaries to overcome at different steps of your kind of career. But overall, I mean, like you said, Oscar, I mean, it should be fun to learn as well. You want to grow as a practitioner for the work. And that's what I'm all about.
And I, as a design-brained guy, I'm going to go back to Rafe Coster and his theory of fun. And he talked about the fact that kind of serotonin, dopamine hits all based on that response. That's play is all about that kind of physiological response to learning, arguably. Now, I know there are some really good psychologists out there who might have nuanced arguments about what that means, but for me, I think it's also like, I think it's formalized learning. I think that's really useful. I think there's peer based learning.
Mm.
But for me, there's also an aspect which I think probably epitomizes much. So I spent a long time as I was a trained marketing professional. I got my diploma in marketing. I kind of knew, theoretically, academically, kind of my stuff, and I was doing, and that doing was transformational. But it's interesting for me how um, the level of confidence that I have in my own ability gets less the more knowledge I have. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect, has an upside and downside, essentially.
Yeah.
And what I find fascinating, particularly around things like monetization design. So, I've been doing monetization design probably 20 years, in various forms. And yet I still feel like I need to know more. I still feel like I don't know all the possibilities and techniques. But there isn't a series. There's a couple of books starting. I'm currently writing one. But there are very few that show different perspectives of how to
Mm.
approach the practical job. There's lots of theory, there's lots of concepts, but those folks out there doing it are often not necessarily aware of the things that they don't know. And to me, that's what that's what I think about the idea of peer mentoring and formal training as being separate but also equally viable and useful elements, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, following all of those different channels and diversifying like the way that you learn is really crucial and is going to
Mm.
help to give you, a really rounded kind of learning. Also, if you hear random purring or yowling, my cat is here.
We
For
we
those of
always like
you
that.
who are just listening, his tail is waggling and
Yeah.
he's headbutting me, and it's just, yeah, it's utter chaos.
Yeah, ginger cats are always the best. We have one as well called Kirby.
Oh, good boy.
I know.
Yeah.
It's my
But yeah,
son's
I
dog.
think,
Yeah,
and
yeah, my son's cat. Yeah.
in terms of so it sounds like have done a lot of, shaping and teaching, like, of
Yeah.
courses and programs and things like that. What are the kinds of, like, how do you kind of like craft that messaging to, kind of communicate to people who are interested in learning about like monetization or,
Yeah.
game development in general? Like, how do you communicate that, like, this is what
So
you're going to get out of
there's
it, and like,
a whole bunch
etc.
of this. So I mean, a lot of games devs out there will probably recognize me from being on stage at various shows, and the kind of I think that's the kind of first entry point. It's almost like I'm a big fan of science communication. I don't think I do that. I think I do game development communication. I spent 5 years as a Unity evangelist trying to do that. And those events where you can go out and you can talk, and there is a fine line with the kind of shows and conferences, because there's a kind of selling thing that's going on. Hopefully indirect. The first rule of these events is you should never sell from the stage. But what should be happening in those environments is it should be a focused period of conversation about a niche specialist area. And unfortunately, I have lots of niche specialist areas. So I will talk about monetization, I'll talk about game design, creativity, I'll talk about live ops, I'll talk about production, I'll talk about, frankly, almost anything to do with making games. Whether I should is another subject. Answers in a postcard, please. But that's kind of, for me, like the first step. And that to me is about tantalizing. For me, the second step is a much more thorough, and often I'm using the same slide deck, by the way, a much more thorough kind of in-depth thing. That's typically a longer session, typically a webinar. In fact, I recently did one with the Pocket Gamer team on, I did a series of 3 webinars, each of which had 3 masterclasses. So I'm going to talk about the progression from doing a talk at a show to doing the webinar to doing the masterclass. So when I'm doing the webinars, I'm going to take a subject. So, for example, engagement and retention design. Now, this is a topic I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So I really have got under the bonnet of it. I really kind of spend a lot of time, and I have that kind of system brain where I'm looking to build frameworks, and the frameworks I use when I'm helping either review a game or design a game myself. So these are tried and tested models. So in the webinar, I'll talk about those models. I'll try and show where they've come from. I'm often not very good at showing you the specific game because I've usually forgotten. there are some amazing folks out there, and people like Rami are brilliant at this as well, where they can actually apply specific examples of a specific game and how that specific game did that thing. I tend not to do that because I find that generally I can't find an example that's perfect.
Mm.
And as soon as you get into having to explain why a game isn't perfect, you've lost the conversation. So when I'm thinking about learning, I'm thinking about what are the key things that you want to learn? What are the key messages, lessons I want you to take away from that? And I then want to provide enough context so that stuff stays in your mind. That's my aim. I'm not sure I do it all the time, but that's my aim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the webinars tend to work. So I'll typically break a webinar into like 3 sections because I've got 3 key areas I want to communicate. 3 is a magic number. Genuinely is. Our brains are much better at remembering 3 things than 2, much better at remembering 3 things than 4. Actually, slightly better at remembering 5 things than 4. Don't ask me why. Odd numbers seem to help.
I like odd numbers, so I agree with this.
Yeah. But above 5, you're lost. I used to have 8 bullets in a slide. Why? Anyway, it's because my brain can think in lots of systems. Anyway, moving on. So the webinar is an intense bombarding of information, which you probably need to rewatch in order to kind of absorb. The next stage, and again, this comes to a principle called Bloom's taxonomy. I don't know if have you heard of Bloom's taxonomy? So it's a thing used in learning practice. So basically, and I'm going to, for those actual people who know what they're talking about in academia, please forgive me. I'm just trying to summarize it because I'm not an expert at it. So the lowest level of the Bloom's taxonomy is, can I repeat what you've said, basically? Yeah. So repetition, that sort of thing. And then as you go and you get more deeper down the levels, and I forgot what the specific levels are, but essentially it's all about kind of starting to understand, and then most importantly being able to apply, and then being able to sort of teach, basically. I mean, again, I'm paraphrasing, I'm kind of not saying it quite right, but if you think about that kind of flow, the ability to recognize what was said and repeat it back, the ability to then start to understand what that meant, and then to be able to apply it in context. Now, how do you do that? Well, so what I tend to do is I try to create a replication of my webinar, the 3 topics, and I'll have 3 exercises. And each exercise will do something related to that topic. So, for example, I might talk about player utility. Okay, what's player utility? That's the stuff that we as players need. We need this for the game to feel great and amazing. And I have a model for that around subsistence, shortcuts, socials, and strategy. If you want to know what they mean, go check out my webinar. I won't bore you with it on this one. But I'm going to get you in this workshop to work with other people, 2 or 3 other people, and come back and pitch to the group what the player utility is for a game that you've all chosen. And then you pitch that to us. And we go, yeah, no, what about this? And then each group does that. Now, I like these kind of interactive group sessions as opposed to kind of webinar style lectures, because what they do is they make you have to apply. And the most important thing is we're actually using game principles, game design principles in that model, because what do games do? They reward you. And what's the reward? You get feedback and you get told your thing was good.
Yeah, and you're an active participant as well. And I think that's something really important to look out for, not necessarily that every single piece of learning, reading a book about UX research isn't exactly going to be your choose your own adventure. Although that sounds actually really fun. And now I kind of want to write a choose your own adventure where do you run a survey or write a discussion guide? Yeah. What do you do? And then something happens. That actually sounds like a lot of fun.
That sounds amazing.
But no, having that kind of structure.
You say that, just to highlight, there is a series of books called Head First. I thoroughly recommend. Head First, do things. I've got one right here called PHP and MySQL. I've got others over there somewhere around, Java and Python coding and stuff like that. Now, it's not quite choose your own adventure. What they do, though, is they basically deliberately make mistakes. So you do the exercise and it's wrong, and then they tell you it's wrong, and they tell you why it's wrong, and they get you to solve it, and then they tell you whether you're right or wrong afterwards. It's really nice. So it's the closest to your description of a choose your own
That's
adventure.
really interesting.
It's
I'm
really
trying to
good.
decide if
Yeah.
I would be completely flabbergasted and like frustrated, or feel very proud of myself if I was able to like detect like, oh wait, this is like an
It's
issue.
really nicely written. I'm a
Nice.
big fan of
That
it.
sounds really,
Yeah.
really
So
interesting.
it's a series called Head First. It's and O'Reilly O'Reilly is the publishing house.
Oh yeah, they're
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So yeah, so we've got this. So we've done this transition from the kind of tantalizing you to bombarding you with information. You need to decide how you're going to absorb, and repetition level response to application. And this is something I've applied in a number of ways. So we work with Indie Lab, who are a accelerator program. They've worked with film and TV, and we provide the games material for their courses. So we've had a bunch of teams join that, and in that we actually mix up the training. So it's not just the exercises I'm describing. We do those obviously as well, but it's the mix of doing a webinar type format, having industry people. We've had some amazing industry people. Paul from Mediatonic, we have Sean from Hutch Games, we've had Simon from Space Ape. Some fab. I mean, Phil from Jagex. A whole bunch of amazing people, and they will either do a panel. So I'll do a panel and I'll mediate that, a bit like we do our kind of podcasts. But the audience, which is a small audience, if you're in an accelerator, you're typically talking about 10, 15, maybe 20 people, depending on the size. Bigger than that, it stops becoming as effective. But it's interesting because you've got this format where you're listening to experts who they recognize, talking to them about their personal experience in a context, being interviewed and not interrogated, but kind of like led through a path to show a pattern. At the same time as having a webinar type format where they get a kind of information dump and then an application. So, and this, just so you know, Indie Lab is more about your kind of business. How do you create a game's business rather than making a game? That's the intention of it. But what I think is fascinating is, and by the way, this is not the only one. The Yuki guys do one, and various other people do things as well. But the point about that is most of the value is actually in the bond between the teams who are there, because it's their ability to understand each other's needs, wants, and differences. And it's the differences between the teams which changes your perspective. And I think if there's anything that's most like powerful about that is when your perspective is challenged and you're ready to accept it, I think that you learn more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, especially having like the right group sizes as well.
Mm.
So looking to see, like how many people are going to be attending these courses and who you're going to be working with and things like that is really important because, typically, smaller group environments, you're able to get more time with, whoever is leading the course or or the boot camp or whatever,
Yeah.
accelerator, whatever, insert noun here about learning. And then particularly, who you're going to be working with, and that it should definitely have some kind of, tangible deliverable at the end of the day so that, you can show people, the work that you've done, whether if it's putting together a case study, or an approach, or a game on Itch.io, something to demonstrate that you have put the learnings into practice,
Yeah.
and as well as communicate, the steps that you took to
No, exactly.
execute.
So there's other aspects of this as well. So I mean, we can talk about mentoring, but also application of real data. I think is an interesting one as well. So um, with we've got a couple of teams that we work with. So when we're doing the consultancy training things, there's some teams that we work with, some big, some small. Where we'll start with a kind of webinar style format, and then we'll lead into the workshop format. But then after that, after you've talked about the theory, what's also very interesting to do is for the game team that you're working with to provide you with the data from that game. And then you create specific exercises that tie back to the theory that you then set up for the the team themselves to work on. The aim being is that you actually get real data, you get to apply the theory to it, and then you propose an action.
Mm-hmm.
And then proposing the action in the context of having somebody who's been training you on the theory acting as that kind of sounding board, and other teams with different theories competing for being the winning thing. Competition in this is so useful. Not always, but generally.
Right.
I'll tell you a little bit about friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, friendly competition. I'll tell you about fruit-based games at one point. But anyway, the idea being you get those, and then you get them to do the thing, either to design it and then come back to the group and have a review, or to actually implement it and then get the data from what the implementation was and have the review.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that continuum, you've gone from engaging the mind, thinking about the thing, learning how to apply it, then actually applying it, and then not just applying it, but working out what went right or wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, we follow a really similar kind of formula we just recently formulated a design thinking fundamentals course, which we delivered a few months ago. I wasn't part of that team, but the people did like an amazing job, and they ran it remotely, which is also a whole nother can of worms.
Honestly,
whether you have it remotely or not.
I like remotely. Remotely is great, and actually, in some ways, if you're using a tool like Miro, in the background, they get to keep that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It just turns into, another, learning tool that's interactable. And again, especially with the course that we gave, the team was quite distributed, across, I think even it was the UK and the US.
Yeah.
And they had no exposure to design thinking at all. And we had, we broke it up into 4 sessions over the course of a week, I think. And we were able to have 30 some odd professionals. I think we had like 3 or 4 facilitators, which kind of helped break up into have people break up into breakout rooms so that they could have that kind of like smaller setting and still have time with like each of the moderators. And it worked really well, and we followed that exact model of here is design thinking and how it all works in the double diamond. And then really focusing in on, some kind of like, starting out with a lecture of a new principle, like understanding the problem, ideation, prioritizing, etc., and then jumping into an activity and sharing back with the group to really help, understand like, okay, did we actually like, understand like what the principles are and, how were they implemented, and from there also, if you have a really great instructor, they'll be able to detect where the gaps are and be able to fill those in, and also really probe and ask, follow-up questions about how, your students were able to, come to the conclusions that they did, during those activities.
No, absolutely. And I think this gets into the sort of next sort of like development. Actually, before I go into the mentoring bit, I'm going to talk about fruit-based games. So one of my favorite things to do actually was inspired by a kind of facilitation technique that I learned from Alan Kitchen, a guy called Alan Kitchen, who was one of the sort of producer types when I was in a Telco 3, the mobile operator 3. And he was brilliant because he basically made sure that every time we did a kind of review of what we want to do as a product, he sat us in a room and he made us do these breaks, which were stupid things, and the prizes were fruit-based in some form. Now, I kind of took that a bit further and not so healthily, and I discovered a really lovely way of doing it. So in a full day session, so I would sometimes do a 7-hour session. It's a long time, very long time.
That's a long time.
It's incredibly effective. But the way to make it effective is you've got to make it a competition. So what I used to do is basically this is a full design course, a full day design course. And essentially I will get you to use one of the exercises based on a de Bono technique, a method I learned when I was at Sony. And basically the idea is that you kind of like use existing examples, changing things around, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, doesn't matter what the specifics are. The I think 6 different stages and then a kind of final update. But at each of the different stages, the people would essentially vote using a fruit sweet. And the fruit sweet, because it's wrapped, meant that it could be handed to somebody else. And this is pre-COVID, by the way. So, I'm not sure I'd do it in COVID era or COVID risk. But anyway, the point was that you got to have a sweet per round to give to somebody else. And then you got to see how high the stack of sweets you'd gathered as a team was.
Edible dot voting. I'm into it.
Edible voting. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Turned out that the chocolate coins was not such a good idea because they melt.
Melty, yeah.
But honestly, the impact, and there is actually some sound psychological evidence for this, because the competition element drives an anxiety, kind of not a bad one, a kind of anxiety that stimulates creativity. It's interesting because there's these two competing elements of psychology about feeling safe in order to be creative, but also competition triggers creativity in a different way. So you've got to create a safe environment for people to feel comfortable, and you've got to create a sense of healthy competition to be able to maximize that creative process. And what better than to have a really trivial thing like a sweet as something that you have to give away to somebody else. So you're gifting them, therefore you're being generous to them, and at the same time you're receiving, and you want to have the highest stack. So it was a perfect combination of those things. Anyway, I'm saying that because there are things beyond the actual material about the way you deliver the information and the way you deliver the environment that you gain the information that's also as important about how people learn.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the same with anything else. You can have the most, it could be the most interesting and fascinating topic. And I think we've all kind of run into this where we're like, wow, this is going to be a great talk or a great lecture or something. And then you go in and the presenter, and today we're going to be talking about, playtesting in video games and how it can help your game design. And and if it's not that callback or having that kind of energy, then it can really fall on deaf ears.
We had when I was growing up, I had an economics teacher. I've forgotten his name, sadly, and he had the most monotone voice ever. And it's economics, and he's talking about monotone.
And it's economics, yeah.
And he's lovely.
Sorry, economics people, you're all really great. I've met a lot of great economics people.
Yeah, exactly. But he was fabulous. But I think I was the only person who got his jokes. He kept making these jokes, and he'd do this. But I'm lucky enough that I could see through the lack of tone, shall we say? But anyway, it's kind of interesting, like the tonality, the emphasis. Performance is part of that process, because at the end of the day, we're just doing storytelling. What's the story if it's not teaching something?
Absolutely, and that's really fundamental to UX research as well, because you have it's the perfect, you have like your objectives or like the plot, and then the characters or the participants, and the plot lines or the questions, and adding that all up to tell a compelling story about what you learned. It's all connected,
and it takes me right back to my game design models, which basically start with the core loop of the start condition: I want to learn something. The challenge: I don't have access to the information this person over here does, but I've got to go through a period of time and absorb that information. The resolution: to do it. And then the reward, which is to have the payoff of having a level of understanding. But if you have complete satisfaction at that point, that's wrong. But then why would you carry on? And actually, what we need is to instill, as creators of training elements, a desire to want more, to know more, to do more, because it's so easy for us to leave people feeling overloaded, unsatisfied, or basically just baffled. So So we talked a lot about kind of like the structures I'm using. I think obviously there's some application about it elsewhere, but I think it's also worth talking about mentoring, because often we'll take these groups. So I think it's almost like the extra piece beyond that, a little bit like that review I was talking about as well. But I think the difference with mentoring, I've been part of a bunch of mentoring programs. Game Founders, Kedringer is like amazing. Set up Game Founders in Tallinn in Estonia, flew over about 100 different games industry people. For some reason, I got to be on that list, which is very nice of her. And I got to meet hundreds of developers from all around the world who were trying to start out their games company. Many of whom are still going. Many of whom I see on a regular basis at international conferences. And what made that so special is they had a safe environment to work in. I think it was 3 months off the top of my head. Might have been 6 weeks. I can't remember. They had different guests appearing each week. They would have half an hour with each person. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've got 100 different people and you get to have half an hour with each of them, and each of the teams gets to half an hour with that person, you can see it all adds up. But you've got people who are like publishers, designers, artists, coders, business people, investors, people who've got decades of experience in industry dumping on you in these different perspectives, and that they're telling stories. They're telling their story to you, new indie developer, and that kind of model I think is really interesting. It's hard to repeat, but it's a really interesting model. It needs investment from generally government to make that sort
Oh
of thing
yeah,
possible.
absolutely. I mean, to
Yeah,
fly people in and have people
yeah,
from all sorts of different, and and I can imagine that also puts, that could put a lot of pressure on, the mentee or the person, the
yeah.
person attending. Like how, what kind of like preparation would you recommend for folks who are who might be attending these kinds of things, or it could even be a conference where like I know at GDC you
Yeah,
can do like the network speed dating,
yeah.
like how do you like how should people who are going into these kind of situations like prepare themselves so they're making sure
Well,
that like they're getting the
the
most out of it?
the first thing is the elevator pitch, and the elevator pitch is it's a cliche, I know, but it's actually really important. What is the elevator pitch to me? To me, it's about what is it you're trying to achieve and why are you the people to do it. You could argue it's also about why is now the right time for that. And if it's more than 3 sentences, you're dead. In fact, if it's more than 20 seconds in its nub, it's too late because you're at the next level and the lift door opens too late. So you've got to really get down to its primitive level so that people can understand what you're about and why you're worth listening to. If you can get past
So
what
this
you're
is
about,
kind of
that
like from
yeah.
a pitching perspective, right?
Oh
Someone
no,
who's
no,
coming in with like
it's still important, even if you're not there to pitch, because
mm-hmm.
if you're the next stage after having the elevator pitch is know what that person can do for you. Realistically, most of the time it's just networking because you don't know what they'll be useful for later. You want them to feel think that you're worthwhile talking to. Now, the reason why you need the elevator pitch, even people you're just networking with, is that they need to frame you. They need to have a reason to remember you,
Right.
because at some point they're going to meet somebody who needs you or who has something that will help you. And if they haven't framed you in the right box, they're not going to remember. So that's why I think it's only the elevator pitch. The second thing is, what the hell do you want from them? And if you don't know what you want from them, you've got to tell them, by the way. You've got to tell them what they want. Because
Yes.
most of the time you don't. I did this similar thing with I'm trying to make a gaming actual game, real play podcast at the moment, and I'm talking to some audio drama people, and I met a few of them recently, and I'm trying to network and find out, and I took too long telling them what I wanted from them. So it's not, even though I'm saying these things, I know I everybody no one does it quite right.
Oh, no one's
Uh,
perfect.
no,
No,
it's perfect.
definitely not. Yeah.
Yeah, but I was just saying not to stress about it. So knowing what you're about and why you're worth paying attention to, knowing what you want from them, but also being realistic about that, and be you want to be framing it as, I could do with help, please help me. Would you be willing to help me is a fantastic line. A human being has respond really well to would you be willing, much better than I'm going to be the best thing since sliced bread, jump on board now.
Right.
Would you be willing, and be humble about it enough. I mean, okay, we're British. We're British now. But it is a national trait that we tend to be a little bit too humble. I'm not sure I quite fit into that, but
Just to fill I don't know if that part
sorry,
was recorded. I actually just became a British citizen. Well, I say today. I don't know when this is coming out, but on the
yeah.
6th of November, I just became British citizen. So, right. So I'm going to be very humble as a British citizen. But then as an
Yeah,
American, I'm going to be bombastic and brash. So,
yeah.
it all like
It
figures it out at
balances
the end
that
of the
out.
day.
It's all going to be fine. But again, what I mean by it's not about what it is. Is you don't be afraid of doing it, but actually, if you know what you want from them, how do you know what you want from them if you don't know who they are?
I mean, it's worth being direct, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
not, barging in and being like, you're going to be my
no,
mentor. But it's important to show that you've done your research. Usually,
yeah,
people who, you'd be seeking mentorship from, they might already be mentoring. They're probably in some sort of management position or like a very high level contributor. They're very busy. And so doing that legwork for them helps them in preparation. There's less legwork for them to do to
yeah,
kind of, instead of having this nebulous ask of like, I need help. And it's like, okay, but like how and when and how often, and if you come in with like a specific but flexible ask of saying like, hey, I really want to learn more about moderating workshops.
yeah,
And, I saw that you work for such and such and have seen you on YouTube or a podcast or whatever. Or I really like what you posted on LinkedIn about X. I would love to hear more about that. Do you have 30 minutes available? Even something very simple as that,
so
and
slick.
could be so helpful. Can you
No, but
tell I've done
genuinely,
this before?
yeah, no, but that's exactly. And,
Yeah.
and in my case, so obviously, I'm ridiculously open to this stuff, and I probably shouldn't, right? Because I don't have enough time realistically. But I try to. I end up holding court a lot when I don't mean. I genuinely don't mean to. I just end up having like 5, 6 people wanting to ask me similar things. I don't mind if you don't know who the hell I am. Personally, other people find it hard. But the problem is, if somebody like me, if you give me 5 seconds to explain who I am, I've just taken up the half an hour.
Hmm.
And that's not because I am very verbose, but it's more that um, I don't know which bit is going to be most interesting and
Right. There are a
useful.
lot of different hats that we all
Yeah,
have. Are we talking about, career
yeah,
transitioning? Are we talking about, qualitative, research, quantitative research, and then there are only certain things I'm really going to be able to help you with. So, let's not waste time here and really figure out like, am I really going to be the right person to
yeah.
help you on your journey?
But also, there's other aspects, which is there's a line where you're now asking me to give you my paycheck for free because my professional job is to design games. If you're asking me to essentially design your game for you, you're asking me to give you my
Right.
actual professionalism, which has a charge to it normally, for free. Now, again, I'm I get told off by my business partner a lot because I give away far too much, and rightly so. But the point is that um, understanding what the value of that information is also a factor.
Absolutely. And I mean, it just comes from a place of respect and it's
Yeah,
not gatekeeping, right? Because I
no,
think, some people could feel like, well, all in, and not to say that, it's bad that, all information is free and, we should all share and be open and transparent with one another and share, each other's like expertise and upskill each other. And that's all, fantastic and
And we
very much on
should.
board with that. And we
Yeah,
absolutely
yeah,
should. And I am so incredible. I mean, that is a big part of how I got here today. I
yeah.
do not have formal training in UX research, but from the goodness of like mentors and just informational interviews and things like that, and then also it helps a lot that I have a psychology background and all that good stuff.
Only a little.
But I was very respectful of their time and
Yeah,
understanding that this is very much extra.
yeah,
If there was something I could do after that to help them, I would offer that. And so it's really all just about that, and just really going into it knowing that
yeah,
time isn't free. There's always going to be a cost to it.
yeah,
And that, if for some reason they say, actually, I really don't have time at the moment, it has nothing to do with you personally, or anything like that. It's
yeah.
just, sometimes there's only so much time.
Exactly. And a lot of people get worried. Oh, they hate me. They're not going to talk to me, because they haven't replied. Well, probably because they've had about 500 emails that day.
Mhm.
And maybe they've gotten out of the bed the wrong side. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are going on. They're human beings.
That too.
Even I'm a human being. No, no, that's not true. So but anyway, so back to the mentoring thing.
I can see the wires through the beard. You're not high. You're not. You're not fooling anyone.
Not fooling anyone. But yeah, so the mentoring. So I think peer level mentoring is also very important. What I mean by that is nurturing a community of folks who you can, share that kind of. I'm not talking about inappropriate. I'm talking about, as in, you don't have to share your whole life story with everybody all the time. I probably do that too much. But having a group of people. So I have a bunch of folks I go to a lot of conferences with that I can just break out with, and we'll often end up talking about things that aren't industry based, but occasionally some industry stuff leaks out, and they're incredibly helpful folks, and they're genuinely friends, and if they have a problem, I'll help them and they'll help me. And having that safety network is as much a part of the process, but equally you're gaining so much information. For example, even if it's just the current state of certain types of industry issues, whatever that might be, where the current state of the market at the moment. Obviously redundancy is a terrible thing. I think I heard that there was a report out suggesting that the redundancies in the industry this year are around 20% of the staff. Now, that's probably higher than reality, but I mean, it still shows you the starkness of what's been going on. But equally, other people will be highlighting to me, oh, but we've started seeing deals that were talked about in March are now starting to get investment.
Mm.
And then you see, other folks who've actually got announcements out. So without that kind of peer group, I wouldn't have that sense of, oh, I'm not daft. That thing isn't just me thinking that.
Right. The struggles that
Yeah.
I'm having are struggles that other people are having,
Yes.
which is also really validating and, and feeling
Yeah.
seen. And that's why it's so great to have Cough, the game dev local Discord.
Yay.
Pretty great stuff, lots of different
Yeah.
topics, broken out that people can discuss, and also share pictures of their pets, because every
Obviously.
doesn't matter if it's professional or not, everyone should
No,
have a pets channel.
everyone.
To remind us all we're
It's
human,
mandatory.
and we
Yeah.
absolutely. And yeah, to get, that kind of like holistic picture of like what's going on, and sharing, being on the journey with other people, and finding others that like share your, identity, is really important in any sort of like professional development, throughout wherever you are in your
And
kind of career.
we are very lucky being in games, because in the film industry and TV industry, I understand this is a lot less common.
Oh, it's cutthroat. I have
Yeah,
several
yeah,
friends in film, and it
yeah,
is rough. I mean, working in games is can also be quite tough and
yeah,
competitive too. But I feel like the nature of games is, focus on collaboration
yeah.
and supporting one another,
Well,
and things like
we
that. I mean,
have to.
that's happening more in films now, but
Yeah.
it's very hierarchical, and
Yeah.
anyways.
We have to be collaborative in games because we've got so many different disciplines.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's so much more complicated in many ways.
Right.
Although
Existing in a
maybe not
silo
silent.
just really isn't an option
No,
anymore.
exactly.
Yeah.
But also, you know, when you see one shooter versus another shooter, they're not necessarily directly competing. They may well have a lot of overlap and they may be very competitive, and there are lots of, you know, commercial secrets that should be sustained and maintained, and do not breach your NDAs. It's just not worth it. You know, do not even breach your friendly
I
ones.
waggled my finger back and forth at like a no, don't do that for
Yeah.
the listeners.
I love the fact that you're annotating your physical actions. I should do that.
Yes.
You know, just assume if you're just listening, I'm just bouncing around and my hat is wobbling. That's pretty much constant. But yeah, no, I think so. Let's just try and sum back where we've said. So we talked about formal education, various organisations is a great thing, and we thoroughly recommend people do that. I'm lucky enough that I come from an era where I didn't have to worry about tuition fees, but obviously I think that's a terrible cooling effect on the world. But at the end of the day, the organisations that are out there, they are now doing much better jobs of teaching the formal skill sets than they ever have. I still have questions over the training around specifically design and monetization strategies, but that's because I'm completely obsessed with my particular special interest. I happen to be trained as a marketeer, and that is turned out to be very applicable to becoming essentially game design focused as well, and also why I tend to do much more commercial functions. So that's my favorite. And obviously psychology, you know, you're talking about having formal training in psychology. Oh my goodness, I wish I had some of that myself. I should have written a book on psychology of game design, which I never got around to doing. Maybe we should chat about that another time. But so formal takes you to a certain level. The difference between formal and application is a bit of a gulf. We've talked about things like accelerator programs and webinars, all of which are very much out there for you to investigate. Webinars generally are free, often will have some sort of commercial principle behind it, but the best ones will not be selling from the stage. They will be giving you information that's useful, and by the way, they can also sell you this thing that can help you. I've talked about masterclasses. In my particular form of masterclass, I've talked about interactive experiences and the value of having group training sessions, which you can do. Now, there was a point where Yuki did some with me and various other people, but I don't know who's doing that at the moment generally. But anyway, there's also similar things to that happening with some of the online groups. So Indie Game Business, there's a group. What's the name of the group I recently discovered that I'm going to try and do some stuff with? Is it Funsmith Club? Yeah, there's a anyway, the Discord's called Funsmith Club. Basically, it's a game design education group. So there are groups out there. Find the ones for your special interest. But then moving on, mentoring, finding mentors. So we haven't talked about groups like Intergames and Video Games Ambassadors. I'm on both of those Discords, although I've been a terrible mentor because I never seem to have time. But Limit Break and Video Games Ambassadors are folks that do some really interesting things. Video Game Ambassadors is how I ended up doing the Freshers Week stuff with Staffordshire University's London campus. I'm talking to those guys. But it was also things like the UK Games Industry Slack. Obviously, you have to be a professional already to be able to get into that. But there's one last thing before we kind of like close off I want to talk about, which is I think a particular issue we've got in the industry, which a lot of these things we've said so far underlies the kind of fundamental problem, which is going from student to junior, junior to mid, mid to senior, senior to lead especially where lead is a managerial function, not a specialist skill. As in, it's not it's not about improving your coding skills. It's about learning a brand new set of skills called leadership or management. I'd love to know what you think are about that process. So I don't think we're serving that well at all. And I don't think the companies are either A, able, or B, probably set up to do it. I was going to say willing,
Yeah.
but I think that's a bit unfair.
Well, I mean, I do, I mean, I think like the at least the first word that comes to mind is oof, because you're right. I think a lot of people are, who are extremely good at their jobs as, individual contributors. That's kind of erroneously kind of assumed that, well, because they're really good at their job, they're going to be really good at teaching people how to also be good at their jobs,
Yeah,
or product manage and things like that,
yeah.
where, that really does require a particular set of skills, as they say, and requires, that empathy and communication skills and product management
There's
skills and things like
surrounding
that
soft
do need to
skills.
be directly taught.
Mm, mm,
It is kind of something you can get from, if you have a great manager,
mm.
hold on to them for dear life, get as many one-to-ones as you can with them and pick their brain and see what they're reading and listening to. I know for me, since I've been, I've been leading projects for a number of years now and things like that, but I'm always looking for ways to kind of train in those sorts of areas. And there was a really great book about, I think it was called How to Be a Good Manager. I'll put it in the description.
Mm, mm,
Um, but it's really fantastic, and just kind of details the journey of exactly like this. I forget what her name was, but amazing at her job. Had no idea how to be a manager,
yeah.
and all the kind of skills
Well, there's
that come
also
with
the book,
that.
The Peter Principle, where you get you get promoted to your highest level of incompetence.
Yeah,
So the reason I
yeah,
mention all that is because I think we have a very deep problem with this in the industry, in my opinion.
hmm
I think that part of that comes down to we don't have clearly defined functional roles. We're not got consistent. Who knows what a game designer is? I mean, actually, at a level of precision, I don't think we would always talk about the same thing when we say a game designer. We're
hmm
rarely even saying the same thing when we talk about a game coder. So I think there's an issue with the level of precision. And what we end up with is we hire people into roles and then have to basically kind of shadow them until they've got the skill set, which
hmm
means that we've got to do our job and half of their job. And therefore, I think that causes some incredible friction and tension and pressure for the people who are having to go up a level without mentoring, without training, without webinars and accelerator programs and things like that. We will continue to struggle with that kind of problem, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. I think it's really important to continue, that professional development, and to especially stay in touch with, whether, well, I hope you're communicating with the people you work with, but also especially people you don't work with and other professional networks and, you know, NDAs, respected, sharing what parts of the craft you can so that,
Yeah,
we're able to have that shared vocabulary.
cool. So, what's that one bit of advice you would give people when they're thinking about this topic, whether you're in the person seeking the advice or the person wishing to offer it?
Delivering it. Yeah, I think so. If you're, for someone who is seeking it, I would say have, like you were saying, Oscar, have a defined ask, a goal or an objective that you want from the learning. And especially if it's like a course or a boot camp, and particularly if it costs money, talk to others, talk to people who have either taken the course or have someone who is, well seasoned in the field, have them review the syllabus, see what they think, or have a chat with, one of the instructors, and see, how they're kind of like, their like teaching style is. And then for those who, are mentoring, to one, don't be so hard on yourself for, if you get some, it, in terms of if you make a mistake or you don't have enough time, or, and be open to learning yourself, because just because, you're mentoring and teaching doesn't mean you have to know absolutely everything. And it's definitely a shared journey. And so, that's what I would say for at least something that I've taken away from mentoring is that, yes, I might be sharing my knowledge, but I'm constantly learning new ways of articulating and storytelling and finding new ways of delivering, the same information, in just slightly different ways that work for, people in different parts of their learning journey.
I personally say that that's the most fun part of it. The fact that when I'm doing it, I'm learning. And it's also forcing me in the best possible way, giving me the excuse to get better at the things that I'm talking about because I'm never satisfied. But I think it's understanding that's enjoyable. I think being, again, back to the point, the reason I have a Podquest to learn everything about game development that you never dare to ask is because I love game dev. I love making games. I want to continue to be better at it. And I don't think you ever get to the point where you can't learn more.
Agreed.
So, on that note, Laura, thank you so much for this. It's been a great conversation talking about learning and mentoring and education and engaging in the production and management of games. But it can apply to any industry, as we've said. We've talked about how the actual learning process is a self-fulfilling prophecy for the people doing the teaching. And we've talked about the challenges that we face as an industry in order to make sure that even though we're a relatively small industry, relatively small companies, we still need to ensure that we get people the skills, not just for the job they're doing, but the job they're going to do next. It's in our mutual interest. And on that note, if you enjoyed this, if you think what we've been saying has been interesting or challenging, or you disagree, come and talk to us. Talk to us on the Game Dev Local Discord. We're out there. We're ready to chat to you. And also, let's see what other topics you want us to talk about, what you think is interesting, important, poignant for this industry. So if you enjoyed it, like, subscribe, share, tell other people about it, and most importantly, come and join us on the Discord channel. And on that note, from me, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Hope to hear from you soon.